Hello ladies and gentlemen of the World Wide Web. Welcome to part 2 of my two-part series dissecting the entire life history of the M3 Lee. In part 1, we covered the M3's initial development and the M2 that came before it and what all changes led to the M3. We covered the M3 entering production, we covered the construction of the Detroit tank arsenal, and the establishment of the American tank industry. We covered all the initial bottlenecks encountered in M3 production and how they were remediated, and we encountered the British getting involved in the whole rigmarole. In this episode, the title does not deceive you. This is a slightly confusing guide to the M3. Although, since the slightly confusing guide part is only going to make up a small chunk of a larger video, which itself is a part 2 of a larger thing, I decided to change up the name just a little bit, and this is indeed a somewhat bewildering guide to the M3 Lee, with a very, very special guest. And indeed, I figure what better way to introduce a guest than to just throw him in right at the beginning. Although it's usually my autism to cover every single minute variant and change of all these different tanks, going through all the different models that are made, this time I decided I should give the honors to someone who I think actually really deserves it, and someone who is damn near as good at this as I am. You may have heard of him. He's only more successful, more responsible, and more Irish than I am. He's the only man that I would consider my true rival, seeing that he stole my idea for a video series dissecting the evolution of the KV and IS series. But most of you just know him as Red Wrench. Red, thank you so much for being a part of this video, and tell us, what different variants of the M3 actually existed, and how the hell do you tell them all apart?
Hello, and thanks Edda for that lovely introduction. Basically, you'll hear all of these vehicles referred to as the M3, either the M3 Lee or the M3 Grant, same as you would with, say, the M4 Sherman. But like the M4, the M3 is a specific model of the vehicle. In this case, the M3 is the base model, with as many features as possible carried over from the M2 medium. The most important legacy feature is the fact that the M3, like many pre-war or early war tanks, used riveted construction for the armour plates on its hull. It also had the same air-cooled right radial engine as the M2. A staggering 3,712 M3s were built as Lees, and 1,211 were built as Grants by Pullman, PSC, Baldwin, Chrysler and Alco. As the war in Europe progressed and the US got more data and more insight into what made tanks good, they decided to upgrade the M3. The M3A1 was the first of these upgrades, first requested in July of 1940. It was becoming clear that bolts and rivets, while cheap and easy, did not respond well to being shot at by high-caliber anti-tank weapons and tended to shear off under stress, flinging red-hot shards of metal around the inside of the vehicle. Tank crews did not enjoy this phenomenon. A solution was to create the armour out of large pieces of cast metal, the key innovation of the M3A1. This eliminated any pesky fasteners, but also made the entire armour arrangement more rounded, meaning no weak seams and less chance of a completely direct impact. If you have the industrial capacity, it's also a lot cheaper and easier to produce. It's a shame that the M3A1 looks so unbelievably cursed. Alco managed to produce 300 M3A1s that were identical to the M3 aside from the cast armour. Despite their superiority to the M3A1s were never sent overseas, and there were never any M3A1s built as Grants. They all stayed in the US for training. Good riddance. The M3A2 explored the other way of eliminating bolts and rivets, with welding. Welded armour is the only real way to do it these days, but back then it was very much a new idea, and the US took a lot of convincing that the welds would hold up under combat conditions. After some strenuous testing in 1941, they were convinced, however, and recommended that a welded M3 should be used in place of the traditional riveted vehicles. The welded M3A2 was so good, in fact, that they built a whole 12 of them, 2 Lees and 10 Grants. But this wasn't to do with the welding, it was to do with the engine. The M3A2 was being made by Baldwin, but as my hairy American friend already told you, Baldwin were instructed in November 1941 to convert their production line to use the new twin diesel engine. These welded hull diesel engine vehicles were known as M3A3s, of which a healthy 322 were built, 239 Lees and 83 Grants. The M3 Grant tank that the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum have been restoring is an M3A3, which is a bit mad considering that Australia only got 18 of them. It's a great series of videos if you haven't seen it already. The M3A4, believe it or not, returned to the riveted hull construction. Welding an entire tank hull was actually quite difficult in 1941, and not all manufacturers could pull it off. But these vehicles were different to the base model M3s in that they used the A57 Chrysler multi-bank engine. Yeah, the 5 car engines duct taped together, laugh it up. Anyway, this larger, heavier engine meant two things: that the hull had to be extended by 11 inches, and that the suspension needed reinforced. Chrysler developed these heavy-duty VVSS bogies for the M3A4 with offset return rollers, and these proved so popular that they were standardized for the M4 Sherman. In the end, the 135 M3A4 Lees produced in the summer of 1942 were too late to see combat, and all 135 stayed in the US for training purposes. The M3A5 was the last iteration of the venerable M3 design and combined the riveted hull with a twin diesel engine. A healthy 591 M3A5s were produced, 210 Lees, and 381 Grants. That was a lot of talking, but here's a little identification table to take with you. Remember, the M3, M3A4, and M3A5 are riveted, using radial, multi-bank, and twin diesel engines respectively. The M3A1 is cast, and uses the radial engine, while the welded hull radial tanks are M3A2s. The welded hull tanks with a twin diesel engine are M3A3s. To tell the engines apart, you look at the rear of the vehicle. The radial engine tanks have no hatches on the engine deck, just this air grate behind the superstructure. They also have twin access doors on the rear panel, beneath that overhang and between their exhausts. The diesel tanks have no rear doors, just a big flat panel at the rear above the exhaust. They do, however, have twin access panels on the engine deck itself. This is a radial, and this is a diesel. You see? The M3A4 is a bit unique, but like I said earlier, can be identified by its offset return rollers. They're also farther apart, just like those on the Shermans using the A57. The engine deck is also longer and sort of flatter looking. It's got a flat panel across the rear above the twin access doors, and one small grate on the engine deck with no access panels. It's important to note here that the Brits couldn't be bothered with all this A1, A2, A3 business. If it used a radial engine, it was a Grant 1. If it used a diesel, it was a Grant 2. They didn't use the M3A4, and the hull construction didn't seem to matter all that much to them. But for us weird guys, a designation like M3A3 Grant gives us all the information we need: hull, engine, and turret. Remember folks, if you are held at gunpoint and asked which variant it is, just guess M3. Statistically, you'll be fine. Anyway, that's me. I hope you enjoyed. I'll pass you back to Etta for more in-depth design oddities that aren't quite as easy to define.
Thank you so much once again to Red Wrench for being a part of this video. I really hope we can collaborate on more stuff in the future. So that covers the main base variants of the M3, on which everything else will be built. But before we start getting into the extraneous stuff, let's first cover all of the different changes that the M3 went through at the start and end of its life. I'm going to try to talk about these design changes generically, so unless otherwise stated, all changes that I will mention will apply to both the Lees and the Grants, and all versions of the M3, the A1, the A2, the A3, the A4, the A5, If there's a specific change that is specific to a Grant, or specific to a Lee, or specific to a Continental engine tank, or specific to a diesel tank, I will specify that. But otherwise, generically, these are evolutionary traits of all models of the M3. In regards to features of early model M3 Lees and Grants, initially, the tanks came with what are called pepper pot exhausts with internal air cleaners, meaning the air cleaners for the engine were mounted inside the engine bay. These, however, created two major problems on the tanks, namely low power output and a short lifespan for the engines. The air cleaners being inside the tank meant that extremely hot air was being pulled through the engine bay to get into the air cleaners. this hot air was expanded, meaning that when it was pushed into the carburetor to mix with fuel, the hot expanded air took up too much space and not enough fuel could be introduced into the carburetor. At the same time, the inherent design of the pepper pot exhausts made for increased back pressure for the exhaust gases, also reducing engine power. So you have bottlenecks in power both at the air intake side and also at the exhaust output side. The Wright Aeronautical Company will be tasked with looking into solutions for this problem, and they'll continue to improve the engine from August of 1941 into January of 1942. The antenna bracket on the left side rear was of a much simplified design. These are found on Lees only, as the Grants had their antennas poking out of the turret, since the radio was in the turret. Early tanks had the twin machine gun holes. Early on, the turret casting included a cupola overhang, specifically on the Lee, as the Grant had a different cupola. And early tanks were equipped with the Hicon hydraulically boosted steering. This proved to be too fragile of a system, and it was replaced with the long lever steering system in August of 1941 with Chrysler and November of 1941 with Alco and others. The British were skeptical of Hicon long before, but even after hearing it was replaced, opted to keep it in their Grants until February of 1942. These early tanks also specifically came with the T41 track type on Lees. The Grants have a different track type, we'll get to that in a minute. Rubber chevron tracks were developed by the end of the M3's life, but saved for the M4. And of course, as previously discussed, the early tanks came with the 75mm short barrel M2 gun. Although I say early, really this gun is the gun on the Lees for like 3/4 of its life. Mid to late features of the M3 include: the side doors were seen as a ballistic weak point and were deleted in the second half of M3 production. Oftentimes the doors had their hinges removed and were simply welded up. Later, a new side plate was created that had no cutouts for the doors. To accommodate the missing door, an escape floor hatch was added. This was recommended in June of 1941, but not implemented until January of 1942. The cast turret of the Lee was smoothed out, so the cupola no longer had that little bulgy overhang. Again, this is for Lees only, as the Grants had a different turret. The antenna bracket turned into the full mount, once again, Lees only. A ventilator was installed on the front left hull roof, as well as on the turret above for the 37mm gun. Again, this is a feature that is not seen on earlier models of the M3, and this applies to both Grants and Lees. Air cleaners were moved outside the engine bay to the rear, and the pepper pot exhausts were replaced with twin fishtail exhausts. Quick fix kits were made and issued in March of 1942. Even later in production, armored covers for the air cleaners were added. Obviously, this is specifically in reference to radial R975 tanks. Eventually, the rivets on the tank become seal welded, the stamped solid spoke type road wheels are introduced later in production, and a track grouser storage box is introduced to the front plate. In February of 1942, the stabilizer was finally introduced on Lee tanks, with counterweights for the 75 and 37mm guns also being developed and added. Make note that the stabilizer entered production with the factories seemingly out of nowhere, and with nobody told how they worked or how to install them. Several letters were written by Chrysler detailing how it was slowing down production as they were having to figure out how to install each stabilizer individually and homebrew things like mounts, as no technical data was supplied to them. Quote, "This makes it necessary for us to set up every unit by trial and error, to work out lengths of wire, conduit, cables, to rework practice clamps and parts as we go along. This resulted in our assembly line becoming an experimental stage for the development of this particular unit. We should all realize that any change in production should be thoroughly worked out and a pilot job approved by production people before the change becomes effective." In March of 1942, the stabilizers were introduced into Grant production. Also in March of 1942, the hull-mounted machine guns were reduced from 2 to 1, and then ordered to be deleted entirely by June. In March of 1942 as well, a new company, the Waterhouse Company in Massachusetts, was brought into the picture to expedite production of canvas covers, as they had been in high demand by the British in the desert. June of 1942, the Grant-style rear stowage bins were introduced to the back of US Lees, although they were missing key tools and equipment such as screwdrivers, bore sights, roll tools, and Thompson submachine gun magazines. However, this would be quickly corrected. In August of 1942, the brakes were changed again to Chrysler self-energizing brakes. And finally, the long-barrel 75mm gun M3 made it into production. Again, more or less the summer. I would say like May, June, July of M3 production of 1942 is when you start seeing the long M375. Beyond all of that, the M3 didn't actually change all that much throughout its life. I mean, the tank was only in production for 1 year. However, in case you were curious, there were also a huge swath of requested changes that the British made for the Grant variant. In fact, initially with the British starting out by requesting just a different turret design and moving the radio, the British during that fall/late 1940 period will continue to request change after change after change to the M3, eventually where the United States government has to finally put their foot down, and there's an internal memo literally saying, we need to tell the British to stop requesting changes. They can't request any more changes because they requested so many. So of course, while these bigger changes were shot down, as the war goes on, the British will continue to request smaller and smaller modifications for the Grants. So let's see what exactly they asked for. British requested features and modifications that are specific to Grant tanks include the following. Obviously, the new turret and radio with the decreased crew count from 7 to 6 members. The original American cupola was removed and split hatches put in place. Not gonna lie, I think this may have affected the United States when designing the Sherman. The radio specifically was replaced with the British number 19 radio set. A square loader's hatch was planned and implemented on the prototypes, but quickly removed, as I already covered. Sand skirts were added to the tanks. Initially this was just a field mod, but eventually in November of 1941 implemented in the factories. Rounded front end skirts are British field mods, where squared off skirts are American factory designed. A 2-inch bomb thrower was included in the turret, plus an additional ammo rack for the bombs. However, initially an armored cover was installed on the 2-inch bomb thrower hull, as the bomb throwers themselves were in short supply. WD-212 rubber tracks, often called double I tracks, were used on the Grants. This track type was only used on the Grant and was used on all Grants. The WD-212 is the definitive Grant tank track. Additional stowage boxes were requested to be put on the rear. These were always on the Grant tanks, but eventually they were added to the Lees later, as I already mentioned. In January of 1942, the British would develop quick detach spare fuel tanks, which increased the tank's range by 30 miles. These were only fitted to British Grants and Lees in the UK though. Although interestingly, in October of 1941, the US Armored Board had also developed quick detach spare fuel drums to be mounted on the M3 and M4, although none were ever actually ordered. So this mod in both circumstances was never used in combat. In February of 1942, the British developed an anti-aircraft flex mount for the Browning 30 cal. Ultimately, 200 were built. In March of 1942, the British removed all hull MGs and plug up the holes. An extra 60-round ammunition rack for the 37mm gun was installed where the radio used to be on the Lee. Very late Grant tanks also had additional fuel tanks on the rear sides. Now, of course, the major combat variants of the M3 are not the only ones that existed. And to remedy my sins committed in the slightly confusing guide to the Panzer IV and Sherman videos, let's try to discuss all the other flavors and variants the M3 came in. The T2/M31 recovery vehicles. As the dawn of the Sherman approached and M3 production started winding down, it was determined by the United States that it might actually be worthwhile converting some of these now obsolete Lee tanks into armored recovery vehicles, as the demand for them was only growing larger. This conversion involved the removal of both the 37 and 75mm guns. The 75mm gun sponson was replaced by a door that the crew could use to get in and out of, with a dummy 75 gun welded over top of it. The side doors were welded shut and the hinges were removed, and in their place, the escape floor hatch was added. The turret basket was removed, and on the floor of the tank was installed a winch. The cable of the winch could be either fed straight through the hull for linear pulling, or up through the turret and out onto a boom for lifting. As you can tell, the 37mm gun was replaced by this boom. And since the boom had to be turned around facing over the back of the engine deck during travel, a dummy 37mm pipe was welded to the rear of the turret, so that in transit while driving around, it looked like the tank was fully armed. Originally, the vehicle was expected to lift 5 tons with the boom by itself, 6 tons if the boom was supported by the rear of the hull. With the boom jacks bracing on the ground, 15 tons was expected to be able to be lifted by the M31. However, the vehicle couldn't do this. It just plainly failed to lift 5 tons with the boom on its own. And with the boom supported to the rear of the hull, 6 tons put considerable strain on the bogies. Still, apparently it was better than anything else the US had at the time, and so it was accepted and put into production. It was planned to build 3 variants: the M31 on the M3 chassis, the M31B1 on the M3A2 chassis, and the M31B2 on the M3A5 chassis. Guys, I'm really trying here. So many M's and so many numbers. It's a lot. However, it seems like the M31B2 nomenclature was abandoned. Thank God, one less thing for me to memorize. In reality, all gas-powered M31s were M31s, and all diesel-powered M31s were M31B1. In total, 509 M31s and 206 M31B1s were built by Baldwin Locomotive. They do end up seeing use in Europe in 1944, although even after this, tests of the platform continued to be done. Aberdeen was not kind to the vehicle and wrote up a very harsh report. Inadequate armament, inadequate turret brake, poor routing of the winch cable, poor visibility from winch controls, and inadequate suspension, just to name a few. In September of 1945, the M31 was declared obsolete. One M31 and one M31B1 were requested to be kept at Aberdeen Proving Grounds for historical purposes, and the rest to be scrapped. Although apparently 12 M31s still exist to this day. The M33 Prime Mover. Even while the M31 wasn't considered obsolete, alternative uses for the chassis were already being drawn up, which really tells you how good of a vehicle it was. In December of 1943, 109 M31s were converted by removing their turrets and booms, adding an air compressor, and installing a machine gun mount, turret ring cupola type arrangement on the top of the 75mm gun hull sponson piece. These vehicles were designated the M33 Prime Mover, and they essentially functioned as glorified artillery tractors, specifically for the 240mm towed howitzers. Some of these vehicles would be used in Italy and would move on to Europe. The Grant ARV Mark I. For the most part, the British received M31s from the US as ARVs and designated them Grant ARV Mark II. Although they were all converted US Lee tanks, not Grants. However, the British did also get the idea to make an ARV out of an M3, and they did build one legitimate ARV out of a proper Grant tank, the Grant ARV Mark I. The conversion involved a detachable jib crane with a chain hoist that was to be installed on two new mounts that were added to the front of the final drive housing. The turret was also removed, and a flex mount for twin Bren machine guns was fitted. But it was quickly decided that an ARV built on the Churchill chassis would be preferred, and so they never made any more than one. The Armored Recovery Vehicle Australia No. 2 and No. 3. Similar to the British and Americans, the Australians also had the idea of making ARVs out of their Grant tanks, although in practice they would only end up converting their Lees, as the Grants were desired more. They lobbed off the turret and installed a 28,000-pound capacity winch and hooked it up to a Mercury V8 engine. A ground anchor was also added to the rear of the tank to assist in pulling heavy loads, and massive tool bins were added to each rear sponson. In production vehicles, an additional auxiliary motor was added to power the ground anchor at the back of the tank, and the Mercury V8 engine was removed. The winch now took power directly from the tank's original engine. By this point, the modified vehicle became known as the ARV Australia No. 3. One vehicle was sent to New Guinea, where it did not perform very well. Then, in 1946, all vehicles were declared obsolete. Separately, in 1950, an M3A5 tank was converted into a beach recovery vehicle and served for another 20 years, before finally being retired to a museum in 1970. The Canal Defense Lights. Nowadays, night vision is the sort of thing that we kind of just take for granted. But remember, back in the 1940s, they didn't have anywhere close to the tech that we do now for fighting at night. Okay, yes, the Soviets had tested it back in 1941, and the US had put night vision on Shermans, and the famous development of the M3 carbine with the night vision scopes, and the Germans with the vampire lamps on the STG-44 and on the Panther. Okay, yes, but all of that was like Generation Zero night vision, very much in its infancy. But the British, looking for a mid-war solution to night fighting, had a brilliant spark of inspiration. What if we just used a big-ass spotlight?
Pull the lever, Crunk.
No, seriously. The idea was, what if we used a light that was so big and so powerful that it could not only illuminate the enemy, but also blind them and prevent them from shooting back as well?
Which means that the light appears to flicker. And the theory was, of course, that if you put flickering lights in people's eyes, you dazzled them and meant they couldn't see anything. That at least was the idea. I don't think it worked very well.
The idea apparently had so much merit that the British figured it was worth converting a Matilda II for this purpose, with a new turret featuring a 13 million watt candle, a million candle power arc lamp. 13 million candle power carbon arc lamp. A 13 million candle power carbon arc lamp. removing the turret and adding a new one with a 13 million with a new turret featuring a 13 million candle power carbon arc lamp. Now, I have no idea what power scale the Now, I have no idea what power scale the candle power unit sits at, but 13 million is a very big number. As the CDL was further developed, the plan was hatched to put one of these spotlight turrets onto an M3. Since this turret made no room for guns, the M3 could sacrifice its 37mm for the spotlight and still retain the 75 hull gun, making it kind of weirdly ideal for this purpose. Eventually, the concept made it all the way to a technical demonstration in September of 1942, with multiple very important US officials present, including General Eisenhower and Gladian Barnes. Now, this demonstration must have come with a generous attendance gratuity because all officials involved came out of the demonstration impressed with the concept, so much so that it was decided to start a CDL program in the US. What is perhaps the most amusing part of this whole story is that this was kept top secret. The endeavor was called Project Cassock, as if the US and British thought they were onto some revolutionary new technology in night fighting that was going to change the course of the war. During the process to develop the CDL in the US, they had to come to several agreements with the British for the knowledge and technology transfer. None of the development of the CDL could be done by a single firm, and that parts and manufacture were divvied up amongst multiple facilities as to maintain secrecy, and final assembly be done under strict military supervision. The British said that it was okay for the US to develop and produce their own CDL tanks so long as they agreed to not be the first to use it in combat, to let the British have the honors of shocking the enemy with this new technology. The soldiers involved in training were kept under incredibly strict supervision. They were denied access to outside communications for 2 months while undergoing training. Anytime they left base, they had to leave in groups of 5, ensuring no one man was ever left alone. If anyone got sick, they were to remain on base and be treated locally, and they were not allowed to be transferred, attend another school or service, or even be discharged. I mean, this literally sounds like some Manhattan Project type stuff.
The power of the sun in the palm of my hand.
In March of 1943, Alco became involved in planned production of what would be the shop tractor T10. For security purposes, the turrets were made by pressed steel car, and the lamp was swapped out from the British original to an even more powerful military spotlight that was already in the US logistics trains. In addition, special gun shields for the 75mm sponsing gun were added. Now, these gun shields were actually developed for the original M3 Lees at British request, but for whatever reason they never actually made it out onto the field and were used exclusively on the canal defense lights. So, were they effective? Well, actually, kind of yes, despite me sort of taking the piss out of the concept. Now, in most instances I've read of the CDL's use, it seems like they were pretty much relegated to auxiliary duties, like lighting stuff up at airfields or other like backline duty stuff. However, the United States brought 64 CDLs up to the Rhine, where they were used to help defend bridges, and apparently were so successful that 10 of these 64 were then rerouted to be sent over to the Pacific Theater to be tried out on the other front, although they did not end up seeing combat. Now, the British, for their part, did send some CDLs to India, but they only made it to the front 2 weeks before the end of the war. The command variants. The British were ever conspicuous of the clever use of command tanks, disguising them as ordinary, non-conspicuous vehicles so that they wouldn't be targeted. Now, command tanks require lots of room to fit radios and things, something that the Grant had plenty of. Initially, the idea was to remove the 75mm hull-mounted gun and place a dummy 75 up onto the turret, replacing the 37. But at that point, the brilliant idea was hatched that you might as well go all in and convert the M3s to look like a Sherman. As far as I know, this was actually a standard modification for M3 command vehicles. Not just this, but in North Africa, it became quite popular to construct a facade over the tanks to make them appear as trucks. The M3, the Crusader, and the Matilda all received this treatment. The Scorpion flail tanks. Now, I bet you didn't expect one of Hobart's funnies to make an appearance in this video, although maybe you probably should have, because if there's one thing you should take away from this series of videos, it's that the M3 and the M4 are basically the same tank. These tanks were a direct reaction to combat in North Africa, where it was often encountered that extensive minefields had been set up by the Germans. Initially, these were built on the Matilda as Scorpion 1 and 2, although interestingly there was also an experimental Scorpion tank built on a Valentine. But the Scorpion 3 was built on the Grant, removing the 75mm hull gun and mounting a massive flail contraption attached via 2 great big metal arms and powered by a truck engine that was mounted in a separate box botched stuck to the side of the hull. Later variants include the Scorpion 4, which was basically the exact same thing as the Scorpion 3, but with an improved left lift arm, and one Scorpion 5, which now used 2 truck engines to power the flail. An additional fuel tank was added to the rear of the tank, and it now used the improved lift arm design for both the left and right lift arms. The initial prototype for the Scorpion 5 was built on an M3A5 Grant, but the actual production variants used the M4A4 Sherman as a base. Although these were specifically developed for the Second Battle of El Alamein, the Grant Scorpion tanks did not see combat there, only the Matilda variants. In 1943 though, the Scorpion 4 would get its moment in the sun when it rolled down the streets of Sicily. The flail tank concept would soldier on in the British Army for the rest of the war, just not built on Grants. The T-24 gun motor carriage. In addition to the US's newfound interest in rapidly scaling up tank production in 1940, also came the desire to establish what would become the tank destroyer branch. Now, without going too far into American tank destroyer doctrine, it was a reaction to German tank forces in France, and prided itself on mobility and firepower. But in 1940 and 41, it was very much in its infancy. In September of 1941, the idea was brought up to mount a tank destroyer gun onto a medium tank chassis. Now, only 4 months prior, in June, the idea of mounting a tank destroyer gun onto a half-track was hatched and pursued. This would lead to what we now know as the M3 GMC, although that vehicle was mounting the M1897 gun. No, not this M1897, the M1897 field gun, which was an American gun developed on the famous French 75. This medium tank-based TD was going to use the newer 3-inch gun M3, which itself was based on an anti-aircraft gun. I know it's all very confusing, and I plan one day to make a video clearing up the design lineage of the American 75 and 76mm guns, but for now, just roll with it. It's confusing, I know. But anyway, this 3-inch caliber anti-aircraft gun was chosen for the program, and Baldwin got to work on a prototype, which resulted in the T-24. And it's exactly as it looks. They took an M3A2 medium tank, chopped the turret off, opened up the roof, deleted the side doors, added ladder rungs to the side, moved the driver over to one side, and threw the 3-inch gun into the hull. For initial purposes, the concept worked, but after a 23-round test, a couple of issues were found, mostly having to do with the height at which the gun was mounted. The T-24 was supposed to have -5 degrees of depression, but in reality it could barely squeeze out -2. Its silhouette was too high, making it an easy target, which might not have been a terrible thing if the tank had the armor to deal with it. And it did not. I'm not entirely sure if the armor was thinner than the standard M3, but they reported that it wasn't thick enough, so I guess there's that. There was also a demand for better automotive performance and crew safety. And so the T-24 was shelved, and Baldwin went back to the drawing board. The T-40/M9 GMC. Now, there's some weird timing here. Essentially, while the T-24 was still undergoing trials at Aberdeen Proving Ground, in December of 1941, a panicked call was made for a tank destroyer mounted on a medium tank chassis, and thus the T-40 program was just initiated. The manufacture of 50-some medium tank GMCs was approved, mounting the 3-inch M1918 gun, which was the predecessor gun to the 3-inch gun M3, and was basically a worse gun in every way, especially for tank destroyer use. I have no idea if whoever initiated the T-40 project just didn't know the T-24 was a thing or what, because it seems to me like they're asking for the exact same thing they were already developing. Although at first glance the gun downgrade is a bit of a head scratcher, the idea was that this vehicle would be an intermediate stopgap, so it was desired that they use the opportunity to put some old stock guns to use, and save the good guns for the real design. Either way, Baldwin simply took the already failed and still existing T-24 back to the shop, made it to the new specs, mounted the new gun, and mounted it lower in the hull. This did actually make a big difference. The depression now stood at a whopping -8 degrees. The elevation was now 29 from the previous 16.5, and traverse was now 10 degrees left and 27 degrees right. Definitely better. However, after a test of only 10 rounds, it was noted that the crew positioning was just awkward. Ammunition was difficult to get to, the breech didn't have enough room to fully recoil when at certain elevations, the elevation and traverse hand cranks were not next to each other and needed 2 people to operate, and there was no direct vision optic for a tank destroyer. And the 5-man crew getting around inside the fighting compartment was difficult and counterintuitive. It was noted that most of these issues could be solved with a few simple modifications, like adding a telescopic sight and moving the elevation wheel so it was no longer in everyone's way and was now next to the traverse handle, and now elevation and traverse could be operated by one guy. and simply ignoring all the other issues. So, in April of 1942, the T-40 was standardized as the M9 gun motor carriage. Just like that. Well, despite it not being a perfect GMC, at least they were planning to make 50 of them, which altogether could have some effect. Until they realized that they only had 28 M1918 guns on hand. And of those 28, they had no idea how many of them were actually still serviceable. So they went looking for factories that could produce some. But the order was so small that it wasn't cost effective for anyone, and so no contracts were ever even drawn up. Then, after all this rigmarole, they finally showed it off to Tank Destroyer Command, who remarked that the M9 did not meet the mobility requirements of Tank Destroyer Doctrine, and thus would not make for a good GMC. Hooray! After a measly 3-month service life, the M9 GMC was cancelled in July of 1942. The M7 HMC Priest. Now, of course, the US wasn't only scrambling to develop medium tanks and tank destroyers, but also mobile artillery. Now, the M7 HMC, or the Priest as the British called it, is a vehicle I'm familiar with, but I actually had no idea that it was built on the M3. In fact, it has a story that intertwines quite nicely with the T-24 and the T-40/M9. In June of 1941, the HMC T9 was developed and tested on the chassis of the M3 Medium. Without going into too much detail, it ended up with many issues and was abandoned. Mounting guns on half-tracks was starting to get very popular. At this exact time, you may recall the development of what will become the M3 GMC half-track was happening. Well, it seems that just as the M3 GMC half-track was adopted over the T-24, a T-19 HMC half-track with a 105mm howitzer was pursued instead of the failed T-9. Baldwin loses again. However, it was still known that this was going to be a stopgap vehicle, and so in October of 1941, another call was made to develop an HMC using the M3 medium tank as a base. Now, if all of you out there have your calendars straight, you may notice that this development is slightly overlapping with the GMCs, the T-24 to be specific. So, this new project had the benefit of hindsight and seeing what wasn't working. Baldwin rebuilt the HMC with the gun mounted as low as possible. It actually had good traverse and elevation, I hope so, it's artillery, and had enough ammunition space for a whopping 44 rounds. In February of 1942, it saw trials at Aberdeen Proving Grounds. And with that came a few changes, generally making the tank roomier, redesigning the casemate to be larger, and moving around ammunition to fit more, going from that original 44 rounds to 52 when it was all said and done. The armor was brought down to 12.7mm, and a 12.7mm of its own was installed in a ring cupola on the front. This is what gave the M7 its iconic name, as the British thought this machine gun position resembled a church pulpit. Not exactly sure how related it is, but the British seem to have given all their SPGs church-related names, which is pretty cool, and once again proves to me that the British have the coolest names for their tanks. Anyway, the vehicle was well liked, especially when compared to the T-19 half-track. In March of 1942, it was approved for production, and in April it was standardized as the M7 HMC. The same month, as you'll recall, that the T-40 was standardized as the M9 GMC. Indeed, the development of the M7 is what gave Baldwin many of its ideas for the T-40, and so the development of the M7 and M9 are legitimately intertwined. I probably don't need to say this, but unlike the M9, the M7 will go on to be wildly successful with just about everyone who used it and see service all throughout World War II, and even after World War II with some nations. Now, unfortunately, we can't go any further because we'll be here for literal years, as the M7 has its own story and bunch of variants, sub-variants, and we'll be here till the end of time. Maybe one day I'll break out of tanks and do some videos on SPGs and we can revisit the M7. For now though, I'll finish it off by saying that by 1944 the Sherman was obviously much more prolific than the M3, and so the M7B1 was developed, which is basically the same thing as an M7 but built on the Sherman chassis instead of the Lee, plus all of the later style M7 accessories. Also, apparently there's a dozer version of the M7, but again, we can't go any further than this, we have to stop here. Sorry, not sorry. With war looming and France having fallen, 1940 sees the massive shift in US Army structure, doctrine, funding, etc., as I've mentioned earlier. And one of those big lessons is that we need to do more training maneuvers and war games here in the United States using tanks. Some of the most famous of these exercises happened in Louisiana and Texas, with 18 M2 medium tanks and 400 light tanks. Included in these exercises were the then famed 7th Cavalry Brigade, which had built a reputation in the 1930s of success. Ultimately, through these war games, the exploits of the 7th Cavalry were finally able to be teamed up with a proper infantry tank brigade and do some real damage. It was through these successes that Generals Chaffee, Magruder, Patton, and Brigadier General Frank Andrews went directly to General George C. Marshall and advocated for the creation of an official armored force within the US military, using the 7th Cavalry as a template. The first two divisions were stood up soon after this, with the first one appearing in Fort Benning, Georgia, and the second one appearing in Fort Knox, Kentucky. A year later, in 1941, several now famous maneuvers were conducted, including the largest one down in Louisiana, which involved 400,000 men, and then several other smaller maneuvers down in the Carolinas and Tennessee. Now, why do I bring all of this up? Well, it's to highlight the fact that the US was still in its teething stages of tactics and structure, and they needed tanks to see them through it. Particularly in 1941, when these efforts are doubled down on, this green US Army had to understand how to use a medium tank. And to do so, they had the M3. I think it's immensely important to recognize that in this opening year, the force that would fight overseas was established on the M3. Without it, you have American tankers who don't know how to tank with anything larger than a 37mm gun. You have engineers who don't know how to build a bridge for a 30-ton tank, or recovery teams who don't know how to tow one. You have logistics teams that have no idea how many 75mm shells medium tanks can expend in one operation. Sure, you could say that without the M3, they would just be doing all this training on the M2A1, but what's also important to consider is what comes after. Yes, the M3 Lee is very similar to the M2A1, and the M4 is very similar to the M3. But the M4 and the M2A1 are not at all the same. The M3 is exactly what it needed to be, the stopgap. As a training tool, the M3 Lee served its job and more under every nation that was a part of the Allies. But where I think it matters the most is in the United States. It not only established the American tank industry, but also the American armored force itself. Training exercises with the M3 continued in all the aforementioned areas through all of 1941 and even through most of 1942. The Carolinas, Louisiana, Fort Benning, and Fort Knox, where by far the hardest photo of the M3 Lee that has ever been taken was taken. As the war in Africa kicked off, a new training center was established in the Californian desert, right up on the border with Arizona. The Desert Training Center will prove to be invaluable in preparing the United States Army for its environment in which it will first see combat against the Germans. And once again, they were training on the M3. Training exercises with the United States on the M3 would continue in the British Isles, where in May of 1942, the first US troops landed in Ireland for staging. US tanks will see their first real combat action in November of 1942 in North Africa. By this point, the Sherman did exist and was in production, and actually coming off the lines in pretty substantial numbers. In fact, you might recall that by this point, November of 1942, the M3 Lee has ceased production for 4 months. However, after the fall of Tobruk, Sherman tanks were stripped from American units to be given to the British to fulfill Churchill's request for as many Sherman tanks as you can spare. Quote unquote. His words, not mine. When US tanks first face off against the Germans in Tunisia, it is with the M3. However, tank losses during the North Africa campaign, of which there were many, were replaced by M4 Shermans. At its height, 86 M3 Lees served with the 1st Armored Division in North Africa, but by February of 1943, only 51 were left. In the Asian Pacific, 15 M3 Lee tanks were used during an operation on Budatar Island in the Gilberts, November of 1943. Besides some initial trouble on the beaches, the tanks actually ended up performing quite well. About 252 M3 tanks show up on the British mainland. They were used in training of UK, US, and Canadian troops, but remained on the island in case of a German invasion. The British will end up being by far the largest users of the M3, seeing combat both in North Africa and the Southeast Asian Pacific, and definitely in the latter, front a lot more so than it was in the US. As mentioned previously, the British had invested heavily into the US, predicting that they were going to be needing them to supply tanks. They were allowed a peek into development of the M3 and were even allowed to make some pretty significant changes to the design. In a lot of ways, the M3 was made just as much for Britain as it was for the US. Kind of, not really. If they could get something else, they probably would have, but the Grant's what they had, and I think they make the most of it. I think they made the most of it, genuinely. Initially, it was planned that the Grant was going to be the variant for the British, and the Lee would be the variant strictly for the Americans. However, by December of 1941, only 10 tanks had made it into British hands, despite shipments beginning all the way back in August. Not even mentioning that of those 10 tanks, 5 weren't even combat ready. The British needed tanks badly, and so it was approved to send over American Lees to the British as well as the Grants. As the tanks were evaluated before being issued out to units, the British saw fit to make several modifications in the field to better suit desert conditions. These modifications include sand skirts, which were originally a field mod but quickly implemented in US factories, new ammunition stowage bins to fit 80 rounds of 75mm ammo at the expense of 37mm stowage. Previously, the tank held 50 rounds of 75 and 182 of 37mm, but with the new ammo rack changes, it held 80 of both 75 and 37. These changes were made in April of 1942. Removal of the twin-hole machine guns. British desert camouflage paint schemes were applied in March of 1942. The addition of the commander's vein sight, which started with the C Squadron 3rd RTR in May of 1942, and dust covers for the 75 and 37mm guns. These were approved in January, implemented in US factories in April, but weren't a common sight until September of 1942. Many of these field mods would be relayed back to the factories in America so that they could be applied officially, as we discussed earlier. As they get their hands on American Lee tanks, several modifications are once again requested to make the Lees as functionally close to Grants as possible. Many of these modifications being very similar to the same as what they did with the Grants. May of 1942 requested changes to Lees going to Britain include remove the US cupola and install the split hatches, as seen on the Grant, add a commander's periscope, add an anti-aircraft gun mount, provide additional ventilation, install the British radio, install additional splash guards, add a driver's periscope, install water tanks, install a British compass, install 2-inch smoke bomb throwers, plug up the whole machine gun holes, install a cooker, as well as a host of very minor changes such as changes to the electrical systems and stuff like that. The M3 saw its first official combat action with the 4th Brigade of the 7th Armored Division against the 15th Panzer Division at the Battle of Gazala. Losses were heavy, and although it was noted after the battle that the Germans were genuinely surprised by the firepower of the 75mm, the 10.5cm howitzer and the Flak 88 were just too much. Although against the 3.7 and 5cm guns, the Grants fared more than well. One account points to a Grant tank that took 31 hits, of which only 3 did any significant damage. Another account claims 12 hits with 0 penetration. However, the Battle of Gazala would ultimately be a German victory and result in the fall of Tobruk. In March of 1942, the British Army sat with 340 operational M3 tanks of both Lees and Grants. By June, the British Army had 185 tanks total of all types. What immediately followed was the First Battle of El Alamein, where the British had to make do with what little they still had in a more defensive fight. M3 tanks were dug into hull-down positions to better hide their tall silhouette in the desert. By September, the Panzer IV had unveiled its new KWK-40 7.5cm gun in the Unsung G. And in the Battle of Alam el Haifa, 31 out of 164 M3 tanks were lost. As mentioned in the US section, after the fall of Tobruk, Churchill appealed directly to President Roosevelt to ask for as many Sherman tanks as he could spare, and in September, his wish had been granted. In addition to the arrival of the Sherman tanks, diesel-powered M3s had also finally made it to the British, in both the M3A3 and M3A5 variations. On October 23, 1942, the Second Battle of El Alamein began, involving 252 Sherman tanks and 210 M3s. The Second Battle of El Alamein is a notorious one, specifically kind of for being the combat debut of the Sherman and the real turning point in the North African theater. But I think it's important to note that the M3 was there in just as much numbers. And to be honest, I think the success of the Second Battle of El Alamein had more to do with the fact that the Allies had been bolstered with this new number of tanks, and they had changed leadership and learned from previous mistakes. I think there was a lot more that went into the Second Battle of El Alamein being a success. More so than Sherman shows up, all of a sudden they start winning. And don't get me wrong, the Sherman's a great tank. Like, obviously, I love the Sherman. Like, Sherman's a great tank, and obviously it's better than the M3 Lee, or the M3 Grant even. But again, I don't think it's quite fair to just chalk up the entire Second Battle of El Alamein to the Sherman. Because, I mean, look, the numbers. The M3 Lee was there. The M3 was in almost equal numbers as the Sherman. The M3 kind of has a heroic story in North Africa, in my opinion. It showed up in theater, got its ass beat, held the line, and refused to give up. And then was there when all the fresh new tanks and forces showed up and got to be there for the charge back into that territory and the victory that it had suffered so hard in hopes for, and seeing it through to the end, not giving up. Was the M3 the best tank? No. Was it an amazing tank for North Africa? No. Was it good? I think so. Did it do its job? Yes, more so, in my humble opinion. I want to give a little bit more credit to the M3, specifically in the Second Battle of El Alamein, in my humble opinion. Now, of course, North Africa would not be the only front in which the M3 would serve, specifically with the British in Southeast Asia Pacific, and the British use of the M3 in this theater much more extensively than the US is really what makes the British the largest users of the M3. Here, the most notable combat use of the M3 will occur during the Burma campaign, where M3 tanks were shipped directly from American factories all the way to India to help reinforce the British Commonwealth forces after the Japanese invasion. These tanks would arrive in February of 1942, but it wouldn't be until the reconquering of Burma in 1944 when those M3 tanks would see their first real combat action in the Asian Pacific. You see, while in most senses the design of the M3 was impractical, the fighting in Asia proved that its weaknesses could actually be turned into strengths. The Burma campaign, and indeed the entire Southeast Asian Pacific as a whole, is notoriously hostile in its weather and terrain, specifically to tanks. With its horrible rainy seasons, humidity, thick forest, tall trees, steep hills and mountains, rivers and bogs, these were environments in which tanks were deemed almost impossible to operate in. And yet, the M3 did. Use of tanks in these environments typically surmounted to infantry support roles, such as bunker busting in close quarters, or taking the high ground in a local battlefield and acting as mobile strongpoints for the infantry. In this regard, the bizarre castle-like structure of the M3 was almost oddly perfect. Sure, on the open steppes of Russia, the tank stood out like a sore thumb, but it is in unconventional environments where you may find use for an unconventional tank. It was noted that the tall silhouette and twin guns of the M3 were actually an advantage when traveling through thin mountain roads. The 75mm hull gun could be kept trained forward down the road, while the 37mm on the roof could scan the trees up above. Especially with 37mm canister shot, it proved to be a deadly combination. The lack of tank engagements in this theater also meant that the tank's armor was pretty much never challenged, and its armament was always enough to deal with any infantry threat and the occasional tank. I mean, hell, if the 75mm shocked the Germans in North Africa, can you imagine what the Japanese were thinking? The tank's reliability in these environments also proved paramount on long marches through the mountains. And its easy-to-operate nature combined with a capable running gear meant that the tank was able to climb some of the harshest slopes. If you'd like more of a play-by-play of tank combat in Burma and the Southeast Asia Pacific with the British, I'd recommend this video by From Delaware to India. In the video, he covers one of the few World War II tanks that is actually still sitting in the exact same position in which it was abandoned all those years ago. Also in the video, he cites a book called Tank Tracks to Rangoon, and although I haven't read it myself, I looked it up and it seems pretty cool and like a good read, so I thought I'd recommend it here. It's specifically a book about tank combat in the Southeast Asian Pacific. I've definitely added it to my list. Canada had made plans to create an armored division supplied with M3s all the way back in December of 1940. You see, the British had proclaimed that they wanted to raise 10 armored divisions, and Canada was on the docket to produce one of those 10 divisions. Not only Lee's, but also Canadian-built Valentines were planned to make up this force. It's important to note that at this time, Canada was still very much in the beginning stages of its journey with tanks. From what I can tell, the majority of Canadian M3s were Lee's, although apparently they did use some Grants once they were shipped over to the UK. All gas-powered though. Like most nations that used the M3 besides the British, Soviets, and Americans, these tanks were exclusively used for training, both on Canadian soil and once the units arrived in the UK. Canadian forces were slightly undersupplied when arriving in the UK, as they were supposed to get a lot of their Grant tanks from the British, but the British were currently using them in North Africa. As a result, the Canadian force won't be properly stood up and fully equipped until the Sherman becomes a thing, and by the time they get all their tanks, the Lees are replaced with Shermans. Canadian Lees often had similar modifications to what you'd find with the British. Fearful of a Japanese invasion after Pearl Harbor, Australia would ask the United States and the British for cruiser tanks. Britain specifically would end up diverting tanks being made for them in the US directly to Australia. In total, 757, or 777, the book contradicts itself, M3 tanks would end up in Australia. Interestingly, Australia would end up being the single largest user of diesel-powered Grants, which is a bit of a specific metric, but still pretty cool. Australian modifications to M3 tanks included add-on armor to the differential housing, grenade mesh to the top of the vehicle covering the hatches. Towards the end of the war, the typical M3 bogies were replaced with the M4 Sherman heavy-duty bogies. As far as I know, Australia is the only country that made this backwards retrofit to their M3s. Heavier-duty armored doors were installed on the engine deck. Their own custom deep-water fording kit was developed, track grouser storage directly onto the front of the tank, and many of the same modifications that the British had made, such as extra stowage, extra fuel tanks, through water stowage, split-hatch cupola, sand skirts, and the extra ammo rack. M3s in Australia were reserved for the defense of the homeland, and practically none actually saw combat with Australia, save for a few that went over to the Dutch East Indies as dozer tanks. Gas-powered M3s were declared obsolete by Australia very quickly after the war, but the diesel-powered Grants stuck around, the last ones being retired in 1955, the same year that the United States retires the Sherman. That's pretty impressive. Now, information on this is surprisingly difficult to come by. On one hand, both the book that I have by David Doyle and a book by Honeycutt mention that the 51 M3s that were left with the US 1st Armored Division in North Africa were given to the Free French forces for driver training. However, the Shattuck website, which is a source I trust very much on Sherman and Lee tanks, the Shattuck claims that they have not been able to verify that France got those 51 M3s in either photos or words. And indeed, my own limited research has also come up empty-handed. A Tank Encyclopedia article includes an illustration of an M31 recovery vehicle being used by France in World War II, and a separate article details that M31s were used by France after World War II in Indochina. The vehicles were apparently well liked because they were inexpensive and didn't match anything else that the French had in their army, so they could be used overseas in Indochina, and then when they broke down, they didn't need to care about repairing them or recovering them, and they just left them there because they don't care about them. The M3's use in France is either negligibly important or severely understudied. Without consulting anything written in French or knowing anyone in France, I really can't say much on my own, but it seems like there's breadcrumbs to follow here. If anyone out there either speaks French or can do this research or knows anything about the M3's use in France, you could genuinely be a trailblazer in the English-speaking field. So please, reach out to me in my Discord, DM me, leave a comment, whatever you want to do. Go see if you can dig to the bottom of this mystery, because I'm personally quite intrigued. Now this one's going to be a pretty long segment, so I hope you guys can forgive me for just kind of reading directly, consulting my notes, because my camera is starting to run low on battery and the sun is starting to set. Actually, it looks gorgeous, to be honest. We have this and then Brazil, and then we're finished. The Soviets actually first learned about the M3's existence through the American press. I have no reason to doubt that it was through the extensive media coverage that was on the M3. Like I said, this tank had a ton of fanfare behind it. Also, quite interestingly, the Soviets learned about the T1, or M6, heavy tank also through the American press, which that makes a lot of sense because the M6 was used exclusively as a propaganda tool during World War II after it was deemed not suitable for combat by the US military. Also, believe it or not, the Soviets actually had extensive knowledge on the M2, but were not totally sure they wanted any, and I'm not totally sure that I blame them. Apparently it's a common misconception that the Soviets had actually gotten their hands on some M2s. They didn't, they just knew a lot about it. But after seeing the M3, they recognized that it was a clear improvement over the M2, and in October of 1941 made the move to purchase some. 1,386 M3s were shipped to the Soviets. Only 976, or 957, the book contradicts itself yet again, actually made it, however, with a vast majority coming in through the northern shipping route. President Roosevelt made fulfilling Soviet Lend-Lease a top priority, even saying that materiel should be shipped to the Soviet Union, quote, regardless of the effect of these shipments on any other part of our war program, end quote. As a result, many things were slightly botched when it came to shipping M3s to the Soviets. In one example, 15 tanks were shipped to the Soviet Union missing their cupolas, which arrived later in a separate shipment. Some tanks were shipped missing their turrets, some missing their machine guns, and many missing the most common and basic spare parts or tools. In one note, the Soviets said, quote, the situation with spare parts is so serious that they need to be obtained at any cost. There is not a single tool for tightening tracks available, no spark plug wrenches. There are no simple wrenches to tighten or unscrew a nut. These tanks are not combat ready, the smallest miscalibration and they will be useless, and the crews helpless to fix them. Although considering all the issues we've gone over with the M3's production, I'm not too terribly surprised by this. Although I said earlier that the US was generally quite good with QA, it seems that the top priority of shipping these M3 tanks to the Soviet Union seemed to have in some cases bypassed this QA. Vehicle manuals and documentation for the tanks were not initially available in Russian, leaving much confusion among the Soviets as to how to actually use the tanks. Eventually, in February of 1942, a translated manual was made available, although it still contained many errors. The gasoline used in the R975 engine was not made available, so the Soviets had to substitute it with their own aviation fuel. As a result, the Soviets did not like the high-octane gas that the M3 required and demanded a diesel engine. As I'm sure you kind of probably already know, the Soviets just generally felt that a diesel engine was superior for tank work and generally didn't like gas engines in the M3. And to be honest, I don't blame them. As I mentioned earlier, that there's pretty much no downsides to using a diesel engine in a tank. So yeah, I don't blame them for that. Although surprisingly, despite the Soviets' heavy preference for diesel engines, they never actually end up getting any diesel-powered Lees. Instead, they hold off for purchasing of M4A2 Sherman diesel-powered tanks. Armor-piercing rounds were not initially shipped with the M3, making the Soviets believe that the 75mm gun was only meant to fire HE and was thus meant for shooting specifically at infantry. Even once AP shells were made available, this was kind of a training tick that had been adopted that they had to kind of unlearn, that like, oh no, the 75 can be and is good at shooting and killing tanks. The height and boxy build of the M3 was criticized, however, at the same time praised because they found that they could fit 10 infantrymen along with the 7-man crew inside the tank, thus fulfilling their IFV fetish. If the Soviets couldn't get you to hang on to the side of the tank, by God, they were going to find a way to stuff you inside of it. They also disliked the riveted construction of the tank. Sadly, they'd never get their hands on the M3A2 or the M3A3 welded hulls. So that's just one they missed out on, unfortunately. Generally, they liked the guns on the tank. They were very easy to use, seating and sighting was comfortable, and they had excellent performance. Except for the Browning machine guns, which the Soviets remarked had casings tearing off during automatic fire. Actually, in general, it seems the Soviets were not fans of the Browning machine guns that came with the M3. On-road and off-road top speed was disliked. In fact, in tests, it fared worse than a Canadian-built Valentine tank off-road. But off-road maneuverability was considered adequate, outside of moving through swamps and bogs. The mechanical components sat too low in the tank, and it was observed that water could get in easily while fording through particularly deep rivers, and the engine would flood. They also disliked the tank's large turning circle, also a downside of the Sherman with its double differential. In general, the M3 was considered worse than the T-34 in these regards. Also, very interestingly, it was noted that the tank had difficulty scaling vertical earth obstacles as the transmission stuck out too far and the tank could not get grip to climb. Now, there is a very famous German video demonstrating this exact phenomenon in comparison with a Panther. And every time I bring that video up, people say, oh, it's German propaganda, you don't believe it, it's bullshit. To be fair, there is definitely at least one or two shots that they definitely faked, and the guy driving the M3 like gives up halfway through and they let the Panther sail over. But it seems that the Soviets concluded that it was also a genuine fault of the M3. So I feel somewhat vindicated. It's like, I don't want to be, but I am. The return rollers were thought to be too closely mounted to the bogey castings, increasing their wear, which is interesting because this is also a deficiency that the US noticed and actually fixed it with 1-inch spacers inside the bogey, and then eventually when they moved to the heavy-duty Sherman bogies, that also fixes it. The Soviets complained that both the paint inside the tanks and the rubber padding for the crewmates had a tendency to burn, which increased the chances of an ammo cook-off. Now, I have no idea what tests the Soviets were subjecting the M3 to make the paint inside the tank catch fire. I've genuinely never heard any other nation complain about that. Not just with the M3, but like ever. I've never heard anyone ever cite paint catching fire as an issue. And then also they cite that the rubber insulation for like protecting your head inside the tank had a tendency to catch fire. They noted that as a downside. I feel like only the Soviets would be like, yeah, those things that are really great for crew protection and keeping your guys from banging their heads up, yeah, no, get rid of that. We don't like it. It's too likely to catch fire. Although to be fair, the Soviet helmets had built-in padding, so I guess they weren't too particularly concerned about that sort of thing. Niet, comrade, helmet is fine. They disliked the gasoline fuel for its tendency to catch fire when hit by incendiary ammo. Quote, when hit by incendiary ammo, not all gas tanks are Ronsons and catch fire instantly by incendiary ammo, which is specifically meant to catch things on fire. But yes, gas-powered tanks were more susceptible to that. And they did not like that the engine was not specifically protected against Molotov cocktails or flame bombs being thrown on the engine deck. This is something that the Soviets have consistent PTSD over from experience in the Spanish Civil War and also the Winter War later of Molotov cocktails being thrown on the engine deck and leaking down into the engine bay and catching stuff on fire. I cover this in my video on the T-34. It's one of those things that they severely request as like a must-have on the new tank. The T-34, it has to have a way for you to close up the engine louvers or seal off the engine bay at the back so that flames can't leak down into the engine bay. So of course they would note this as a deficiency of a tank that doesn't do that. In the later years, the tank was allegedly nicknamed a coffin for 7 brothers. Some sources claim that this was simply Soviet propaganda and did not actually reflect the view of the tank in the USSR. I'm personally inclined to believe that, but that's just because I really want to like the M3. But I have some evidence for it as well. Pretty much across the board, the Soviets praised the reliability of the mechanical components of the M3, engine, transmission, steering, running gear, etc. They remarked that it was easy to drive, they took interest in the double differential steering system for being both simple and reliable. Quote, having used the tanks for 2 months, during long 110 through 160 kilometer marches on difficult terrain, it can be seen that the engine group works flawlessly. End quote. The radios were also have said to have worked flawlessly, although they criticized them for not being tuned to Soviet radio frequencies, which, boo-hoo. I also have the quote, compared to domestic tanks, it is difficult to access tank components for field repairs, but this is not a significant drawback due to the reliability of the tank in general and its separate components. End quote. Now, I've read across several Soviet notes that parts of the tank were difficult to access for maintenance. But when given examples, it's things like the engine and its accessories. I also have a quote of them praising the accessibility of the suspension, transmission, and differential. Plus, considering the previous critiques of the engine being too low in the tank for wading through water, I believe the Soviets mostly thought that the engine specifically was difficult to access and maintain, which makes sense. The Soviets are used to the T-34 where the entire back end of the tank opens up and you get access to the whole thing right then and there. Whereas on the M3, you either have the engine decks on the top or you've got that tiny little door on the bottom. And it makes sense. That radial engine also takes up its tall space and water can get through that little door at the bottom potentially and flood the bottom of the engine bay. This honestly makes sense to me, especially if you have the T-34 to compare. I can see why you would think the M3 is worse in this regard. Generally, they were impressed with the cooling radiators for the oil and even remarked, quote, the concept of oil cooling should be more common in domestic tank building. End quote. Rubber-padded tracks were liked for their effectiveness in reducing sound and their long life, but were criticized for their poor performance in the snow and ice. Again, uniquely Soviet concerns, but valid nonetheless. Although, in the notes I also have the quote, the rubber metallic track has a long service life and should be considered for implementation in domestic tank building. End quote. Interestingly, I've also stumbled across what I think is notes of the Soviets attempting to copy the stabilizer of the M3 75mm gun for use in the T-34. I'll read this. Quote, produce an experimental prototype of a stabilizer for the 75mm gun on the M3 medium tank and present it for trials by September 1st, 1940. Design and produce a stabilizer for the 76mm gun on the T-34 by October 15th and 85mm gun on the IS by November 15th, 1943. End quote. Now, for me, this is a matter of wording, because initially they say to produce a stabilizer for the M3, meaning reverse engineer and build one. But then in the second line, they say to design and produce a stabilizer for the 76 and the 85, meaning build a new one from scratch. I could be reading way too far into this though, so don't quote me. It's an interesting rabbit hole that someone could go down maybe. And it could also just be a translation thing. Armor on the M3 was criticized in formal tests for being too thin, although praised for being very high quality, with a notable lack of cracking and spalling. Gee, I wonder why, because the armor they had to compare it to was shite. In combat, it was noted, quote, "The front and turret armor stands up well against hits from heat shells. All hits to the front of the tank, especially the medium tanks, the M3, fail to penetrate the entire thickness of the armor. As a rule, the shell melts the first layer and then gets stuck. As such, it fails to penetrate into the tank. The side armor, due to its insufficient thickness, is easily penetrated by AT guns, and the top armor can be penetrated by mortars." End quote. Now, to be fair, when talking about the heat, it's not exactly specified what heat they're referring to, but I would imagine it's the heat from the 75mm Pak-37 out of the Panzer IVs. Or KWK-37 out of the Panzer IVs, excuse me. Despite this, the combat record of the M3 Lee was not particularly bad. Sure, it wasn't glowing, but I would hardly say that the tank didn't do very well. I think what's more important, and I would cite this for the British as well in North Africa, is that the M3 was there when it was needed. When the Soviets say, hey, we need to raise 200 tanks for this upcoming operation, if they can pull out 120 T-34s and then fill the gap with the rest 80 M3s, even if those 80 M3s didn't actually do much, they were there. When the Soviet Union needed 200 tanks, the M3 helped them get 200 tanks. And that in itself is really, really important, in my humble opinion. In the combat instances given in my book that I have by David Doyle on the M3, 2 instances are cited where Soviet regiments held off an attack and took quite a few German tanks in the process. And within those regiments, M3 medium tanks and M3 light tanks were present. The book didn't say exactly what the M3s were actually responsible for, but again, they were there when they were needed, and I feel like that's worth something. So take it with a grain of salt. The general consensus on the M3 in the Soviet Union can be paraphrased by this quote from General Lebedev in a meeting with Brigadier General S.P. Spalding of the U.S. Army. Quote, "We have also used your medium M3. The Sherman has been in only a few operations so far, but it is much better than the M3. Mr. Harriman thought that it was not necessary to have riflemen or submachine guns on the tanks. Actually, this is impossible on the M3 due to the large boxy design. However, I wish to say again that your tanks have been fighting very well." Mic drop. Look, man, I would take that. In the carnage of World War II, to say your tanks have been fighting well, that's all I can ask for. Even if they weren't doing very good, they fought. They fought and they died with honor, hopefully. Maybe. Finally, the M3 in Brazil. Brazil was the only nation in South America to receive medium tanks as part of Lend-Lease from the United States. They received both M3 and M4 tanks. In particular, Brazil will get a mixture of M3A3 and M3A5 diesel-powered Lees, about 104 in total. Although Brazilian expeditionary forces would fight in Italy during World War II, they did not bring the Lees with them. The M3 remained in service with Brazil until at least 1960, where during that time they were retrofitted with the Continental radials and transferred to Paraguay. A Brazilian M3 was given back to the United States in 1976 and currently resides in Fort Moore, Georgia. All right, that is it. I gotta go. My hands are freezing. You can see the sun has pretty much set and my hands are freezing. I can barely move. I should have brought gloves. We always think about the M3 as just that tank that came before the Sherman. And while, yes, the M3 was always intended to be a stopgap to fit the 75, while they waited for development of the M4 to kick off and actually happen, after doing all of this research, I don't think I can separate the two tanks anymore. It's very odd, because on one hand, they are not at all the same tank, but on the other hand, they are definitely not two completely different tanks either. It's very weird. They're like conjoined twins that are melded together in ways that are very confusing and a little bit disgusting. But what surprised me the most about doing all this research was how much stuff I previously attributed to the Sherman that actually belongs to the Lee. When describing all of the different production variants of the Sherman, I used to tell people that the welded hull Shermans were for the automobile manufacturers because they know how to do welding. And then the M4A1 casted Sherman was for the locomotive manufacturers because they knew how to do casting. And the variety of engines used I always described as a solution to a bottleneck encountered with production of the Sherman. And all these solutions were found. But no, the casted hulls were not a solution to a production issue, but rather a genuine pursuit of a better hull construction. And the engines were not solutions devised during production of the Sherman, but all the way back in production of the Lee to solve bottlenecks in M3 production. And the Sherman simply inherited it. Even the M4 Sherman's heavy-duty VVSS bogies were first developed for the M3A4 Lee. And then they liked the design so much, they used it on Sherman. And of course, the early models of Sherman used M3 Lee-style bogies. The M3 75mm gun was developed for the Sherman, but then retroactively put back into the Lee towards the very end where they could. The development of these two tanks are so incredibly intertwined. You genuinely cannot tell the story of the Sherman without mentioning the story of the Lee. And you cannot tell the story of the Lee without eventually leading it into the Sherman. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this short series of videos, it shouldn't be that the M3 was a good tank. But it shouldn't be that the M3 was a bad tank. What I hope I've been able to do with these videos is get you to think about the M3 in ways that you haven't before. Hopefully, you've thought about the M3 more than you ever have before. All I can hope for is that a new appreciation for this tank was fostered, for its design, its development, its evolution, its support, and its service. For a tank that we all just dismiss as being the simple stopgap, it's crazy how much content I was able to get out of it, don't you think? But it's also important to stress that the entire reason I was able to summarize pretty much the M3 Lee's entire life into a two-part video series is because this tank was only in production for a single calendar year, and it was only in development for an additional year before that. I mean, broadly speaking, this tank had a development and service life of 2 years. I mean, yes, it saw service into 43, 44, 45, but 1940 to 1942, that's it. That's the M3. Can you imagine if I tried to make a video like this on the Sherman or the T-34? There is so much more that goes on behind the scenes. A tank is so much more than just how big its gun is or how fast it can go. It's so much more than its developmental history or its combat record. Every single tank is a reflection of a nation. It's a snapshot of who that nation is and what circumstances that particular nation finds itself in at that particular time. Its economy, its industry, its size, its politics, its culture, its economics, all of it. There are so many stories that intersect with the design and development of a tank. And then once that tank has been made, all those individual stories just move on afterwards. Again, people like William Knudsen, like the fact that in doing the research for this tank, you can stumble upon the story of such an important and incredible industrial man. Hell, doing research for this tank, I discovered the story of this thing. All the people that are involved, all the facilities, all the money spent and the time. Every single tank just has so much going on behind it. And I really hope that with this video, I was able to show you just a little bit of what that looks like, at least for the M3. In the case of the M3, for me, it tells the story of America at the start of World War II. Duh. But it truly perfectly summarizes the state of the Union in 1940. Not quite ready, but needs to step up now. A new enemy, a new war, a new tank requires a new America. I'm reminded of this quote given during a speech by the Secretary of War, Robert Patterson, during a speech unveiling the first pilot M3 tank to roll off the lines at Baldwin Locomotive Works in March of 1941. this is more than just a tank. It is a tank, the design of which embodies the fruit of lessons learned in the Battle of France. One can almost say that this tank has been through fire. The Battle of France was fought and lost less than a year ago. The drawings for this tank were completed less than 6 months ago. Yet, here it is, ready to be manned by a crew from the new army, which itself was not in existence a year ago. And with that, I'd like to stop talking. And thank you for watching. I seem to say it every single time, but this has genuinely blossomed into my biggest project yet. I've had so much fun researching, writing, recording, and editing for this video, and I know I deeply apologize for just how long it's taken me to get out here, but I am, at heart, a perfectionist. I want to give another shout out and thank you to my patrons. Genuinely, to all of you out there who donate, you are the reasons why I am able to come out here and just do really fun stuff and make such high effort content for you guys. If you're not a patron, but you enjoy this content, I suggest you give it a shot. You'll get access to a special channel in the Discord where you can talk more to me and your fellow patrons directly. You'll get these videos longer formats, you'll get them earlier than everyone else, and you'll get some behind the scenes bonuses. For this video in particular, you'll get both part 1 and 2 uncut, all 1 4-hour feature-length film. I think 3 hours might actually be how long it's gonna be, plus extended bloopers and everything else. It's really worth it. I try to make it worth it. In case you don't already know, I live stream every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday around 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I go live and we play whatever random games we want, sometimes tank related, sometimes not. A huge shout out to everyone who has helped me with this project, particularly Red Wrench. Again, thank you so much for so graciously accepting my offer to be a part of this video for me. Again, I know it took a while to actually get it sorted, but your efforts were magnificent, and I could not be more proud of this final product. So I really do think that's it for me. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Adios, bye-bye. Don't come back. Just kidding, please do. There'll be lots of stuff coming out soon, I promise. Thank you.